Gather around as we spill the tea on cybersecurity. We're talking about the topic in a way that everyone can understand. I'm your host, Jara Rowe, giving you just what you need. This is the Tea on Cybersecurity, a podcast from Trava. Welcome back to the Tea on Cybersecurity. Previously, we learned about vulnerability management and how it relates to compliance. On this episode, we are continuing our journey through security compliance components and getting into risk management. We're going to learn about the intersection of risk management and compliance, navigating challenges, determining acceptable risk levels, and so much more. But as we know, I am not the expert, but I have one with me today. I would like to welcome one of my team members, Michael. I know this is your first episode being with us on the Tea on Cybersecurity, so go ahead and introduce yourself for our listeners.
So my name is Michael Magyar, and I am a vCISO consultant with Trava. So I work with organizations to help build security programs. And it can be a lot of different things from a strategic standpoint or even down to a very granular technical issue that they're having. My background is pretty varied. I've done everything from manage a security operations center to a pen test team, done a lot of compliance work, I've done a lot of AWS cloud engineering, and obviously I've done a lot of vCISO work.
Before I jump into my official questions I have for you, there may be some listeners that don't know what vCISO is. So can you explain that?
Board of directors for an organization ends up hiring executives to run the organization, such as a CEO, chief executive officer, chief operating officer, et cetera. So one of the positions in the executive team will be a chief information security officer. That's being required by a lot of different compliance frameworks and regulations now. And it's make sure that the organization is both compliant and has good security. So for a chief information security officer, sometimes that's hard for an organization to find an appropriate person that has the skill and expertise and is aware of all the other things going on in cybersecurity, especially if there's a smaller organization. A vCISO or virtual CISO is somebody who helps provide that as a staff augmentation. And so I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of organizations in these different roles. And so I can take that knowledge anonymously, of course, and have each organization learn from all the other ones and all the different things that we've seen in the industry.
I've learned a lot about how vCISOs can really help, like those smaller companies and things like that, get all their cybersecurity stuff in place.
There's so much, and it changes so quickly, especially if you haven't seen what other organizations do. You might kind of get siloed in your own little world and not realize all the new features and different security tools or best practices that have changed.
That's why people like you are important for us. Let's go ahead and dive right in, starting with a super simple question, but like me and other people may not know the answer to. What is a risk?
I wrote down the definition, which is the exposure to danger, harm, or loss. We can think of a risk as maybe the chance that a bad thing happens, maybe something as generic as, oh, we were hacked. But it could be something even more or less obvious, like we accidentally released a bug to production and caused an outage, or maybe even something that's not as obvious, like a natural disaster, like a hurricane out in Florida. So we see those all the time. Even something simple as like a hurricane causing everyone to have to not be able to work that week, that is technically a risk to a business.
What is risk management then?
Again, I'll go right back to what is the definition of it, and that's to identify, evaluate, and control risks. That doesn't really help us that much. But if we break that down into three different parts, at one hand, we have to identify what risks do exist. As for example, the natural disaster, we may not think about that as being a cyber risk, but to some extent it can be when we think about availability. So we first have to identify the different risks that are out there. There's common ones that are true for every organization, simple as being hacked or ransomware, or I mentioned things like releasing bugs to production if you create applications. Even losing customers and not having enough revenue is technically a risk for an organization. So this expands much more beyond just cyber. But when we're thinking about cyber risks, there are also industry-specific ones. So maybe the chance that for a healthcare industry that there's a hack and then EPHI, electronic personal health information, gets released. And so then what does that entail? So that's identifying risks, but we also need to evaluate them. And so not only do we need to understand what risks might exist, but we need to understand what impact that might have. And so that goes into both the chance that they're going to happen and the chance that they're going to be successful in creating damage, and then also the likely damage that's going to happen from them. And so those two pieces get put together to understand what a likely overall impact or risk that is to the organization. For management, so we talk about controlling risks, we also have to decide how we're going to deal with that. So most people would say, well, to deal with a risk, you just need to eliminate it entirely. And that is one possible way to deal with a risk, but that's not all the possible ways. Sometimes we might mitigate it. We might say we're not going to fully be able to get rid of the chance we get ransomware, but maybe we have very strong offline backups. And that is our way of at least addressing the outages that might occur from ransomware. There's ways to mitigate it, even if we don't fully take it away, because you can't fully take any risk away. As crazy as it sounds, we can also accept the risk and just say that's a very small risk and the cost it would take to fix it is too great. So let's not actually fix it. Let's accept that risk. It's small. We've done things to mitigate it, et cetera. Or we can also transfer that risk, such as using cyber liability insurance.
We've learned all about insurance in some of our past episodes for sure. Why is risk management important for businesses? And I know regardless of their size or industry.
At the end of the day, we're all business and trying to make sure that we're profitable and having good workflows and all that. So why do we take the time and do risk management? There's two answers to that. One of those is it's being required by compliance. Depending upon the industry you're in, you might actually have a requirement to do an annual risk assessment. And whether you want to or not, doesn't matter. You are required to do it. So you're going to have to do it to be compliant. So that's one reason why we do risk management. Another reason to do it is also to understand that there might be reasons why we want to protect our business. As odd as it is, business that's more of in a startup phase may want to take a lot more risk on. We might say, we don't have any customers yet. We're not going to spend $1 billion on cybersecurity. Let's take more risks in that regard. Let's make sure we can grow a business first. But as you start to gain assets and gain clients and gain reputation and goodwill in the industry, we also have to realize we need to protect that. And so if something bad happens and then that causes damage to the company, if we don't have any value in the company, that's bad. At the same time, that doesn't really hurt our company because there's nothing there. But if we have a lot of value in the company, we need to protect that. So we need to be aware of the different things that can hurt that value. And we need to do what we can to identify what we should mitigate and what we should try to eliminate from a risk standpoint.
How does risk management differ from crisis management?
Risk management is proactive. It's something you do beforehand. And crisis management is oftentimes something that's reactive. And if you're trying to do risk management in the middle of a crisis, it is way too late. So if you, let's say, you're dealing with a ransomware situation, at that point, you're no longer dealing with risk management. At that point, the risk has materialized, that you are being affected by it, and it is impacting you. At that point, you are dealing with that crisis. Now, both of those things we can plan for ahead of time. We can do risk management proactively and understand what things could happen. We also can do crisis management proactively by planning for that. A lot of organizations have business continuity and disaster recovery plans. So those are ways of planning out how we might address a crisis when it does occur, and we should always plan for that. But risk management is prior to the crisis occurring and the things that we might do to mitigate a crisis before it actually happens. And whereas crisis management oftentimes is, it's already happened and it's too late. Now we're just trying to manage the damage here.
We've talked about the importance of being proactive in cybersecurity versus reactive. So that still rolls right into all of that. And in one of our upcoming episodes, we're going to talk more about incident response plans and tabletop exercises. So those roll into crisis management.
Risk management is more about program evaluation and more about business evaluation as a whole. Components of risk management can affect things like incident response and business continuity, where it may make sense to say, as part of the risk of something happening, we should do a better job of planning for it. And that might reduce the risk to an extent, so that this way, if it does occur, the damage is less. If we have good incident response capabilities, then if we do actually have a breach, then by able to respond to that appropriately, then that allows us to limit the amount of damage that can mitigate that risk, for example. But risk management is more holistic and also looks at a lot of different aspects of the business. So whereas crisis management might be dealing with the effects of a specific issue, risk management is more about program evaluation. And it has a lot more thought about business decisions. We might say there's a risk for us sending bad code out to the production environment. I don't even mean from a security standpoint. I just mean it takes the system offline because we have a bug in it. You might address that with incident response, or you might address that with business continuity to try to maybe fail over to another environment if there's a problem. At the same time, the risk management might say, what proactive controls should we put in place to limit the chance of that even occurring to begin with? And so that's more of that proactive thought process of what possible things could go wrong and what should we do to address it. But then the business side says, how much is that going to cost? And does it make sense for us to actually put in all of these extra things in place, especially if maybe the asset that we're worried about is our marketing website? It would be bad if we have a typo on there, but it's not going to bring the business down. It might be embarrassing, but maybe it's not as important as patching our critical systems for our production environment. There's a business component to decide how important is it and how much should we put resources into addressing it beforehand and trying to prevent it. That's the difference with risk management.
You were touching on this briefly, but why is risk management crucial for compliance efforts?
So some of it is because the compliance framework says you have to do it. And at the end of the day, if you're beholden to that because you're whatever the compliance framework applies to you for your industry, that's the end of it. You have to do it if you want to be compliant. There might be a need to do that for legal reasons. There might be a need to do that to keep your customers so that you get a certification from an auditor. Now, at the same time, though, I do think it's important with compliance to understand there's a lot more for risk management than just looking at it for your business. We're seeing a lot of compliance frameworks adding subcomponents of risk management at different parts of the organization. As odd as it sounds, we actually are seeing risk management becoming a requirement for software development. So before you even write the software or create the application, the question you might have to ask yourself, what risks could occur in this software? And so when you're designing the software to begin with, how does that impact how you design the software? Maybe we decided with more resilience in mind, with higher availability. Maybe we use containers and auto scaling groups and the ability for it to fail over to other regions inside of Odd Provider, for example. So designing that on the front end, if we know the risks that are involved, we can do that appropriately. So we're seeing compliance requiring that more even on the front end of software development. We're seeing it in change management, security impact analysis becoming a requirement for change management. Before you make a change, did you do the analysis of what potential problems this could cause? And then did you get approval from a change management review board, for example? So depending on the framework, we're seeing more and more risk management being brought into other parts of the organization. And so we're seeing a lot of organizations with issues having a breach that wasn't even their fault. Earlier this year, Circle CI had a recent breach and they're asking everyone to rotate their credentials. And so Circle CI being an organization that helps with their software, helps organizations deploy their software to different environments like production and do testing on it and so on. If they have a problem and they get breached, your credentials that have access to your environment to deploy production code, then that becomes a problem too. So exactly, their risks, like you said, their risks become your risks.
What challenges do organizations typically face in aligning risk management with compliance standards? And then what are your tips to help them overcome this?
Most organizations, I think, struggle just even to know where to start. How do I do risk management? How do I do a risk assessment? A lot of times organizations start looking for standards. That's a great place to start. If you don't really know what to do, what is the industry doing, or what are there any publications from NIST, for example, that can help you to know where to start? So NIST publication 800-30 is I have a note on here for that. Yeah. So that's the risk assessment, how NIST wants you to do a risk assessment. I remember the first time I opened that many years ago. And as I'm looking through it, I realized after looking through it for 20 minutes or so, I realized I was on page 4 or 5 out of 95. And I really hadn't gotten anything useful out of it yet. There was a lot of really good information in there. And, of course, I read the whole thing through. But the problem is that it can be very complex to do a very complex risk assessment. And that can be troublesome when you're starting to try to find a guide that is 95 pages and you're thinking, I just need to get my business going here and I need to check this compliance box, or I just want to make sure I'm not really deficient from a security standpoint. It's hard to know where to get started. I think that's the first problem. And I think also what is a risk assessment is hard to define. And unfortunately, it's a lot of different parts of the industry look at it differently. Some organizations for risk assessment say, yep, I thought about it for 5 minutes. I'm happy with all the potential risks that are out. And that's not really risk assessment because you didn't really identify potential risks. You didn't really evaluate impact that could happen and so on. So what is a risk assessment? It can be tricky. Organizations will do a penetration test and count that as a risk assessment. And while that might be an input for risk assessment, that's not enough to think about things like natural disasters or accidental code deployment that has bugs in it, or even insider threat. And so there's a lot of other aspects to risk assessment than just thinking about like a pen test or a vulnerability scan. Tips, what can we do to address that? I think there's a few different things there. There are programs out there that can help third-party organizations. Trava does risk assessments for organizations. So you could always rely upon security vendors to help you there. You could spend the time on learning what a risk assessment is and trying to identify that appropriately. But I would say at the very minimum, it helps to have an outside perspective because you may be blind to a lot of risks that are happening to your organization just because you don't think about them. It's your day-to-day, you're moving through that, and you don't think about how a natural disaster could affect your data center down the street from your corporate office. And if that's all you have, then a natural disaster might really bring you offline. Whereas if you distribute across regions, that would be different. It's easy to miss common risks for an industry as well, too. I think it's good to have an outside perspective, both to know what to do and also to keep in mind the different types of risks that are out there.
You mentioned previously like different levels of risks. How do organizations determine an acceptable level of risk? And then what factors influence those decisions?
A few different answers here. And I think it depends a lot on the business itself. Like I said earlier, smaller businesses might be willing to accept a higher level of risk, and larger businesses that have a lot more goodwill or a lot more client base that they don't want to lose, they might be a lot more concerned about the risk itself and the type of risk that they accept. So they may want to reduce the risk a lot more. A lot of that also might depend upon the industry they're in. Organizations that are required to go through different audits. Like, for example, if an organization is hosting government data in the cloud, so they have to be compliant with FedRAMP, and we're seeing other variants of that like StateRAMP and other options like that. In those cases, it may not even be up to the organization. And so for FedRAMP, once the audit happens on an organization, the output, the security assessment report, will list a residual exposure table. And so those are the different risks that the auditor identified. And at that point, it's up to the government agency to decide, yes, this is an acceptable level of risk or not. So to some extent, it may not even be up to the organization, depending upon what industry they're in. We're also seeing a lot of organizations, when customer requirements come by, they may want to see a risk assessment that was performed by a third party, and they might use that to decide whether or not they want to use that as a vendor. Now, if you're a big organization or if you have many clients, you may not notice losing one or two clients here, but I've worked with organizations who maybe 80% of the business comes from a defense contractor that wants to see all the internals of the risk assessment and says, this is unacceptable for us. And the organization has to fix those because that's such a big client, they can't say no. So I think it depends a lot on the industry they're in and the organizations themselves, the clients that they have, the types of restrictions and requirements that are placed upon them. But at the end of the day, a lot of it's going to depend upon how risky the business should be. If the business has a lot to protect, then you may want to reduce that risk more. If the business doesn't have a lot to protect yet, you may want to just risk a little more to try to make sure you can even become a business and become successful. It can depend. That's not a great answer for society, because unfortunately your data and my data are in some of these businesses. And so we have to keep that in mind. But there's also legal ramifications that can occur if a business is being negligent. So while I say sometimes a business might want to take on more risk, there's always a minimum level where you have to be careful that you're not taking on too much risk, because there might be some scenarios where you might become personally liable for being negligent. That can be tricky.
I know we've gone over this in a previous episode, but you've mentioned it a couple times. And just in case this is a listener's first time listening to the T on cybersecurity, can you explain what like a risk assessment is?
Obviously, we talked about risk management of identifying, evaluating, and controlling risks. So risk assessment is the process of doing that. They can take a lot of different flavors. Some organizations, as I mentioned, just take a bunch of metrics and put those together, and that's how they decide risk management. And you could do that more if you have a program that'll do that for you. But if we wanted to do this more manually and wanted to do this more at an organization level, we could start off and say what risks might occur for an organization. So I mentioned those earlier, like ransomware. The chance that we have a data outage because we have a breach. You might see something like business email compromise, and the fallout of that might be somebody tricks the payment part of the organization, accounting, to send money somewhere else. The risks of loss that way. Natural disasters, insider threat. So there's a lot of different ways of looking at risks, and we can look at those as more of the threat vector, like what actually could occur to cause the problem. So that might be more of a business email compromise, or maybe somebody downloads malware off of a website. So those types of things. We could also get it as the outcome more of we sent money to the wrong place or ransomware. But either way, we have to start off and identify what the risks might be. Think about how likely they are to happen to our organization. And that's where things like a penetration test or a vulnerability scan, that's where those can be put together to say, we have very few vulnerabilities on our vulnerability scan, so our risk is low. Or we have a lot of legacy systems that we don't patch, and therefore our risk level is high for the chance of that happening. But then we need to look at, and this could be at an asset level or a business unit level, but if that does occur, if that does materialize, what is the likely damage? Just our marketing website, the likely damage is going to be loss of goodwill. It's going to be maybe incorrect information on there. Maybe somebody changes our contact information and people are submitting leads to a different organization or something bad like that. But maybe it's not as level of a risk as all of our PII or all of our business secret, all of that stolen. So you have to decide what level of impact that looks like to your organization. And some of this is subjective. You can use objective metrics to try to decide that. Our business is valued at this much, and this business unit is 30% of our business. So this business unit is 30% of our valuation of a company. So we can use objective metrics, but to some extent, it's also going to be subjective for things like goodwill and how much is that going to impact customers, for example. There's going to be some subjective decisions there. identifying the risks and likelihood that they occur, identifying the potential impact and how bad that would be. And so those two together give us our risk likelihood, or our overall risk for a specific event or specific outcome of an event. And then the assessment portion starts to end there. And that's where then we do evaluation of that, of what do we want to do? Do we want to try to address these risks? Do we want to try to limit them? What are potential ways of strengthening our security posture or strengthening our detection or response capabilities to lessen the chance that either the risk occurs or lessen the impact if it does occur? And that's when we can decide how much money we want to spend or how many resources we want to spend on reducing that risk, or do we accept it? I think that process is the risk assessment, which is most of what risk management is, except the risk assessment is more of identifying the risk and the potential damage it might cause, whereas the management of it is then deciding the next step after that of how do we decide how to respond? Do we address the risk? Do we accept the risk? Do we mitigate it? Do we offload it to a cyber liability insurance?
You were also previously just mentioning like monitoring risks. How does continuous monitoring of risks contribute to compliance efforts?
Continuous monitoring of risks can fall into a lot of different paths. So I mentioned earlier yearly risk assessments. Technically, that is continuous monitoring of risks. So if you do that on a regular basis, I recommend at least thinking about risks more frequently than yearly. It doesn't have to be every day. Maybe quarterly is not a bad idea. Has anything changed that requires us to update our risk assessment? Or did we acquire another organization and now this changes our entire risk posture? I think there's an element of doing a risk assessment and making decisions on that for risk management on a regular basis. That's part of that. Another part of it actually is everything else that we do in cybersecurity. If we do phishing training, are we keeping track of the metrics for that? If let's say our metrics are much better, then that can tell us, hey, maybe our risk is a little bit lower. And so in some extent, we're actually continuously reviewing that and continuously monitoring the potential for us to be phished. On the other hand, if they're going up, then we say, hey, our risk has gotten worse, our risk has increased. And so now we need to decide, do we need to change how we're approaching this? Do we need to do better education? Do we need to put more technical measures in place in case somebody does get phished? There's continuous monitoring can be all of our security program is really designed to limit risks, either reduce the chance that they occur or to actually limit the damage. That's all of what we do for security is about risk management, monitoring our security efforts, having continuous breach monitoring through a security operations center or intrusion detection, or even just anti-malware or endpoint protection. All of that, keeping up with all of that is going to be continuous monitoring of risks to an extent.
We honestly just covered so much information in less than a half an hour, and you brought a lot of clarity for me when it comes to like risk management. But before I let you go, is there anything else you would like to drive home about risk management, compliance, or even just general cybersecurity?
There's a lot. There's a lot of information and there's a lot that you can do, and it can be overwhelming. I think my message overall is start small. Even if you are struggling to identify resources to do, risk assessment and risk management, even if you take 20, 30 minutes and get a few people in the room, that someone from a security team, someone from a few different perspectives too, maybe your chief operations officer or CEO, if you're small enough as an organization, bring those people together and ask yourselves, what could go wrong? What could hurt our business? What could hurt us from a legal standpoint? What could cause us to lose our clients? What could cause our systems to go down? What could cause our application to stop working? Bring in engineering and your head developer, and just ask, what are the things that could go wrong for our organization? If you start there and you make it simple like that, and then you say, okay, what could go wrong? How bad would that be for each of those things? You just did a risk assessment. Maybe that's not the best risk assessment. Maybe that doesn't pass all the compliance check requirements that we need to do. But if you start there, at least you could start thinking about that in your organization. And when you approach cybersecurity with that mindset of what could go wrong and then trying to address those things, I think you actually focus and become a lot more efficient at protecting your organization. You can go out and buy all the new fancy tools, or you could try to implement zero trust here and there, and you could go buy the most expensive SIM product out there and buy the most expensive EDR product. You could do all these things. And at the end of the day, did you actually materially affect your organization in a positive way, or did you spend a lot of money? Stopping and saying, every now and then saying, what are our biggest concerns? What are our biggest risks? How bad would that be if they occur? And then what should we do to try to reduce those risks if we even should? I think that's really the basis of risk assessment. And if we start there, we can go a long way just by being as simplistic as that. I don't want anybody to get overwhelmed. I don't want anybody to think that you hire 10 headcount to do this. It doesn't have to be that intense. But at the very minimum, start there. And then as you mature as an organization, you realize, yes, we actually do need to make sure we're protecting everything appropriately. That's when you can either decide to increase headcount to think about this more frequently or look for a security vendor that can help you to make better decisions for that.
I really appreciate your time, Michael, and your expertise. I'm sure all of our listeners do as well. I look forward to talking to you again on a future episode.
Great. Thank you.
Now that we've spilled the tea on risk management, it's time to go over the receipts. Michael honestly covered so much information during that episode. There are going to be some things I missed in the receipts, but that's okay. It's just supposed to be a compilation of some of the things that I pull. So first up that I have is, what is a risk? And he explained it as it's just an exposure to danger, harm, or loss. But one of the things that really stuck out to me is that a natural disaster can be a risk. And that was something that I never really thought about until he explained it during the episode. Michael also talked about why people find risk management challenging. And he simply said that a lot of people just don't know where to start. I'm sure that's probably a lot of us that are learning through the T on cybersecurity. So if this is one of your issues, you can simply just find a vCISO like Michael or another third-party cybersecurity vendor that can help you set the basics for a risk management and other things. So if you don't know where to start, just seek help. Michael also talked to me about why risk management is crucial for compliance. And it's just that those standards require you to be aware of the risks that your company may have, which only makes sense, especially if you're obtaining a lot of people's data. It's important that the risks of leaking their information or a bad guy coming in and doing something they shouldn't be with your customers' information. Another receipt that I have is the difference between risk management versus crisis management. These are kind of terms that to me before this episode were the same, but Michael let me understand that risk management is more proactive and crisis management is reactive. So a crisis management is the process that you go through if something were to happen. So we also mentioned and talked about things like incident response plans can come into place during a crisis management, but risk management is proactive, trying to get those things not to happen. And then the final thing that I took away from Michael during this is how often people should be looking at their risks. So like continuous monitoring. Michael mentioned that in a lot of the compliance standards that it's required to do it yearly, but he suggested at least quarterly, just so you're aware of how your product is changing, how the information is changing, and any potential holes that may have popped up during that time. I hope you learned as much as I did on risk management. I'll see you on the next episode of the T on Cybersecurity.